Burbank, California, early 1954. A heavy crystal ashtray catches the afternoon sun on a vast mahogany desk inside the Warner Brothers executive building. A 23-year-old James Dean sits opposite a powerful studio boss who has just finished reviewing his screen test. The older man leans back. He taps a cigar against the glass, letting the silence stretch, and delivers what he assumes is a crushing critique. "You have no soul, kid." Jimmy doesn't flinch. Instead, he leans forward and delivers a six-word reply that nearly ends his career before it begins. This is not a story about the leather-jacketed rebel the world would eventually mythologize. It is not about fast cars, teenage angst, or the tragic highway collision that froze him in time. This is about a different kind of collision, a clash that happened entirely behind closed doors, on the top floor of a studio empire built on compliance. In the early 1950s, the Hollywood system operated like a highly efficient assembly line. It manufactured leading men the way factories manufactured appliances. They were expected to be polished, predictable, and strictly controlled. The studio crafted their public personas, dictated their wardrobe, and told them exactly how to smile for the cameras. But James Dean had just arrived from the grit of New York's Actors Studio, and he had absolutely no interest in becoming a product. He wanted to uncover human truth, no matter how ugly or uncomfortable it looked under the studio lights. When Warner Brothers called him in to discuss his potential casting in East of Eden, it was supposed to be a standard intimidation tactic. The executives wanted to ensure this strange, mumbling kid from Indiana knew exactly who held the power. They expected profound gratitude, demanding complete obedience in return. But assumption is not the same as truth. They were completely unprepared for what James Dean was about to tell them, and in a few short minutes, he would expose the hidden contradiction of the entire American film industry. The room itself was designed to make guests feel insignificant. Rich wood paneling stretched toward a towering ceiling. Oversized leather chairs swallowed anyone who sat in them, forcing a posture of submission. Framed posters of triumphant, glossy Warner pictures stared down from the walls, while the muffled, rhythmic hum of a secretary's typewriter leaked through the heavy oak door. The man behind the desk represented the old guard of the Jack Warner regime. He was an executive who measured artistic value purely in box office receipts and cooperativeness. Over the years, he had dealt with hundreds of hungry, desperate actors. He knew exactly how to mold them, and he thoroughly understood how to break them. Leaning over Jimmy's thin personnel file, the boss began his assessment. He told the young actor that his screen test was deeply troubling. The performance was too quiet. It felt utterly bizarre. Leading men, the executive explained, needed to project a glowing, accessible warmth, a recognizable spirit that ticket buyers could easily consume without having to think too hard. He used the word soul. He said Jimmy lacked it. Jimmy sat low in his chair. He wore a rumpled shirt that offended the room's pristine formality, his eyes barely visible beneath his messy hair. He simply listened to the lecture, letting the executive talk in circles about marketability and star power. Have you ever sat across from someone who demanded you change the very core of who you are, just to make their job easier? For James Dean, this lecture wasn't just an insult from an out-of-touch suit. It was a violation of the only thing that kept him tethered to the world. His journey from a motherless farm boy in Fairmount, Indiana, to the hallowed stages of New York hadn't been driven by a shallow desire for fame. Acting was a survival mechanism. It was his singular method for processing profound grief and a lifelong sense of isolation. In the freezing lofts of Manhattan, under the brutal guidance of Lee Strasberg, Jimmy learned to dredge up his darkest memories and put them on stage. He had spent countless hours sitting in the dark of cheap movie theaters, watching the exact kind of pictures this executive proudly produced. He despised them. He saw the fake smiles, the shallow emotions, the plastic heroes who never seemed to feel real pain or genuine terror. To Dean, adopting that sanitized, studio-approved style was a moral betrayal. If he couldn't bleed into a role, he saw no logical reason to play it. He refused to fake his way through a scene just to keep a producer comfortable. The executive noticed the young man's casual, deeply unimpressed posture. The silence from the opposite side of the desk was stretching too long. Annoyance crept into the older man's voice. He shifted in his chair, raised his tone, and laid out an implicit ultimatum. Play the Hollywood game. Show the camera some conventional, wholesome energy. Prove you can be a company man, or pack your bags and go back to scratching out a living doing bit parts on forgotten television shows. If you want to uncover the quiet defiance and hidden history behind Hollywood's greatest legends, subscribe now. These are the untold stories of the people who refuse to break. The older man finally ran out of patience. He brought his palm down flat against the polished wood. The impact made the heavy crystal ashtray rattle. He stared at the unkempt kid sitting across from him, intent on putting this upstart in his proper place, and delivered his final, damning verdict. "You're a blank," the executive snapped. "You give us nothing, you have no soul." Jimmy didn't look away. He stopped slouching. He planted his feet firmly on the carpet, leaned forward into the space the executive was trying to dominate, and let his voice drop to a quiet, dangerous whisper. "I learned it from your films." The muffled sound of the typewriter outside the door seemed to abruptly stop. The executive froze. Jimmy held his gaze, refusing to blink. He hadn't just insulted a studio boss. He had indicted an entire era of American cinema. He had looked at the men who built the Hollywood Dream Factory and told them their life's work was emotionally bankrupt. You do not insult the Warner Brothers catalog inside the Warner Brothers building. The blood rushed to the executive's face. He stood up abruptly, pointing a trembling finger toward the heavy oak door, and ordered the kid out of his office immediately. The meeting was over. The verdict was sealed. Before I tell you what happened next, consider the stakes. Walking out of that room, James Dean was essentially blacklisted by the man sitting in the chair. He had thrown away his big break for the sake of a single, sharp sentence. So how did he end up headlining their biggest picture of the year anyway? The answer was Elia Kazan. The legendary director knew the studio brass despised the young actor. He knew about the disastrous meetings and the bruised egos. But Kazan also knew something the executives could not comprehend. James Dean was the only person alive who could play Cal Trask. He possessed the exact, agonizing frequency of damaged, explosive longing that East of Eden required. The director forced the studio's hand. He demanded Dean for the role, effectively shielding the young actor from the executives who wanted him gone. But this defiance in the executive suite was not a one-time thing. It was a blueprint for how James Dean would navigate his entire, painfully brief career. He possessed a fierce, obsessive need to protect his artistic instrument. He viewed any attempt to polish his edges as a threat to his survival. When costume designers tried to dress him in crisp, tailored clothing that looked appealing on camera, he fought them relentlessly until they allowed him to wear garments that actually felt lived in and real. When the overwhelming pressure of performing, alongside massive stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, on the set of Giant threatened to paralyze him, he notoriously relieved himself in front of the cast and crew, a shocking act designed to shatter his own crippling anxiety. He refused to perform polite society norms if they suffocated his reality. Kazan later noted in his autobiography that Jimmy had a built-in hatred of authority, but that hatred was not born of spoiled, childish brat behavior. It was a sophisticated defense mechanism. Dean understood that if he surrendered to the executives, if he allowed them to sanitize his pain and teach him how to fake a glowing smile, he would lose the profound sensitivity that made his work brilliant in the first place. Think back to that heavy crystal ashtray, that massive mahogany desk. The studio tried to crush him under the sheer weight of their institution. They expected him to cower, assuming he would fold because they controlled the money, the contracts, and the access to fame. But their strategy fundamentally failed. James Dean was entirely immune to their currency of fear. The audiences who bought tickets in 1955 saw James Dean as a generational symbol. They recognized a teenager angry at the world, a confused kid kicking at the dirt, desperately searching for a reason to belong. Many assumed the rebellion on screen was simply a reflection of youthful angst. But behind the scenes, away from the screaming premieres and the blinding flashbulbs, James Dean was waging a much larger, profoundly sophisticated war. He was battling an industry determined to turn genuine human suffering into a cheap, digestible commodity. When he threw that six-word insult across the mahogany desk, he didn't just burn a professional bridge. He accidentally built an impenetrable fortress around his talent. By proving he could not be bought, bullied, or intimidated into smiling on cue, he demonstrated that he was exactly the raw, untamed nerve that post-war cinema desperately needed. The world was shifting. Audiences were carrying the silent, heavy traumas of the 1940s, and they no longer believed in the flawless, sanitized heroes of the past. They were hungry to see the cracks. They needed someone who looked as broken on the outside as they felt on the inside. Dean provided that mirror. His loyalty was never to a studio contract. It certainly wasn't to the men who signed his paychecks. His loyalty belonged entirely to the emotional reality of the scene. He possessed an almost frightening willingness to throw away his ultimate dream before he would let a frightened executive compromise it. The studio boss had told him he lacked a soul. In reality, Dean's soul was the only thing in that executive suite too expensive to purchase. James Dean lived long enough to make only 3 major films. In every single frame, he delivered performances that shattered the polished, rigid mold of Hollywood's golden era. He brought an aching, unfinished, and aggressively alive energy to the silver screen. The men sitting in those top-floor offices, the ones who demanded compliance and conventional charm, never truly understood his genius. They simply realized they could monetize it. But the people sitting in the dark theaters understood him perfectly. He had walked directly into the belly of the beast, stared down the architects of the old Hollywood machine, and calmly informed them that their art was hollow. In doing so, he pried their fingers off the creative wheel and changed the trajectory of American acting forever. Because true rebellion isn't about wearing the perfect leather jacket or driving a fast car. It's about refusing to sell your soul to people who don't even know what one looks like. Have you ever had to walk away from an opportunity because it required you to compromise your integrity? Tell me your story in the comments. I read them. If you appreciate the uncompromising history behind these legends, and you want to keep discovering the real people underneath the Hollywood myths, make sure to subscribe. This is where the true stories live. The next story I want to tell you involves a rainy night, a stray kitten, and the quiet act of kindness James Dean performed just days before he died.